Hey guys. All right, I know we're running a little behind, so we're going to try to rush through this first part so that we can get to the fun part of exercises and writing. So take a seat, come on in. Thank you for coming. My name is Deibel. I'm a lead designer at Grand Studio in Chicago. We're a design consultancy and we build a lot of multi-channel products. And sometimes that includes voice first, sometimes it includes AR, VR, and sometimes it's just screen design. So I lead the voice team over there. And I've been in content and conversational UI design for about 8 years, but voice specifically for about 4. And as a writer and a voice designer, I'm an introvert, so I want to give you guys a heads up. There's gonna be interactivity. Probably not butt rubbing, but make sure that you are at a table with at least 4 other people, or 4 people total, because the first exercise will be a group of 4. So go ahead and get there, and then I actually want your phones out for this talk. We're gonna be tweeting some stuff. We're gonna be using it to take notes. If you wanna have a computer, pen and paper out as well, that's fine. But just be prepared to write and talk. So before we dive in, I just want to quickly acknowledge that there are a couple different philosophies out there in vui, and there's really 2 main camps. There's teaching the user to speak to the system, and there's teaching the system to speak to the user. I fall into the latter camp. So everything that you hear is going to be with that perspective in mind. There are pros and cons to both of those, but just want you to know where all this is coming from. So let's do this. How do we craft natural sounding dialogue? And why do we care? I mean, you could just write something that sounds robotic and it doesn't matter, except the whole reason that we're building any product is for people to use it. We want to help solve a problem. We want to change a behavior. So the way that we do that in voice is to create an engaging experience. And conversation in particular is very, very much about that engagement. You know, if you walk up to somebody walks up to you on the street with a clipboard, that's not engaging. In fact, like we're all just like, get away from me. But they have to have a good rapport with you in order to engage with them. And a lot of times that's kind of what our products are, is that person with the clipboard. So we want to make sure that we're really engaging in order to draw them in and make them come back and use our product again. So in order to do that, I actually use about 5 main tools, which is listening and analysis, thoughtful conversation structure, intentional word choices, accessible cultural and social elements, and of course using voice to its strengths. I've actually put some handouts on some of the tables so you can take that out with you. If you didn't get it, you can always come find me later and I'll get you some more. But we're going to go through these one by one. So let's start with listening and analyzing. This is such a good place to start if you're not familiar with what conversation is like in terms of its structure. We don't really think about that because we've just literally been doing this since the day we could talk. So we don't really think about how does it all work and how does it interact and what are the pieces of it. So really, you just need to channel your inner stalker, go lurk around some people, take a notebook and some paper. This is actually an improv exercise. Take a notepad and paper or your phone and just go sit in some place busy like a bus or a cafe and write down everything you hear. Write down all the ums, write down all the noises that happen around it, write down when there are pauses or turns in conversations, write down the way people are clarifying, and then review it so that you can actually see how things work within a conversation. And the way that we take these sort of non sequitur turns or refer back to things that happened in a previous conversation or earlier on in our conversation, because that's going to help you understand how the structure of a conversation works and allow you to program some of that in with your bot. So let's do it. All right, you're at your groups. I want you guys to find somebody at your table, partner up with them. So choose somebody now. Person next to you works just fine. If you don't have a partner, raise your hand. People raising hands, find each other. There's somebody right there if you want to match with them. All right, now make sure that you guys are partner with somebody else. So there should be 4 of you now total. Everybody in teams of 4? If you're not, there's 2 people over there I see that could use 2 more. So you have your 2-person partnership, and then each 2-person partnership needs another 2-person partnership. So there should be 4 total. Yeah, why don't you guys go sit with them? You can come back to your spot. This is just for this exercise. Take something to write with. All right, so each group of 4 decide which partnership is group 1 and which is group 2. All right, everybody got it? Okay, so group 1, you guys are going to have a conversation. You're just going to talk. Group 2, you're going to write down everything that they say. Make sure you get everything. I'll give you guys a minute, and then we'll flip. Like I said, I'm an introvert, and I'm not a cruel human being, so I'm going to give you guys some topics to talk about. So go ahead and start talking. Group 1, group 2, you should write everything down. Ready, set, go. All right, group 1, stop. Group 2, it's your turn to talk. Group 1, write down everything that group 2 says. All right, wrap it up. Okay, I hope that went well. You guys will be able to analyze that a little bit later, and hopefully now you have a friend as well. So what I hope that you also heard in that, in addition to maybe like some of the pauses, some of the word choices, are also the relationships. So we can tell a lot about how related people are by the way that they're speaking to one another. The words that they choose, the length of time in between when each one of them is talking, the way that they phrase things. People tend to be more formal when they're not as comfortable with somebody, as opposed to when they are very comfortable, they tend to use more intimate language. So when you're thinking about this in terms of voice spots, you really want to make sure that your system behaviors imply the right power dynamics for that relationship that you want to create. So if you want to be a more formalized bot, then you want to think about a longer latency. You want to think about more formalized language. Whereas if you want to be more intimate, then you want to think about, well, what kind of familiar language will I accept, will I use? And maybe I want to be able to use bargain so that I'm in a more subservient position as a bot. All these things you want to consider so that you're making sure that whatever behaviors you've endowed to your bot are implying the correct relationship for what you're promoting to your end user. All right, let's talk a little bit about thoughtful conversation structure. This is probably something that you've heard a lot about. This is day 3 of the conference. I hope that you've heard about it by now, but just in case. This is one of the building blocks of voice design, is this Grice's cooperative principle, and there are also some maxims that go along with this, but in general, it's the idea that in a conversation, we're all working together to create a logical conversation, give each other enough information to get to the next step in that conversation. So something like, do you know who's going to the party? I mean, really, technically, that's a yes-no answer, right? This man could say yes. But that is like a straight dick move, to be quite honest. What really is happening in that question is two questions that have been funneled into one. Do you know, so that yes-no piece, and who's going to the party? So the actual information of who is going. So really what that question, the answer should be is, yes, Tito, Michael, Jermaine, and Randy are all going to this party, so that we actually have enough information to move forward in the conversation. So this is something else that comes up when you're thinking about how to structure a conversation, and this is incredibly difficult, I think, for everybody dealing in the vui space, is discoverability. And how do you list out choices? How do you let the user know what they can do in your bot, in your app, without lecturing them? Because we can only handle 20 seconds of information at a time without having a visual. We need to take a break. There's too much cognitive load. We're not going to be able to track with it. So a lot of times, especially like when you look at older IVRs or systems that use like DTMF, this is often what you see. And I'm actually going to read this out loud to you because this is about 15 to 18 seconds, depending on how fast I go. So it falls fully within that 20-second window, and it feels very long. Thanks for calling the ABC Company customer service line. If you know the extension of the person you wish to reach, please enter it now. To speak with the operator, press 0 at any time. For sales, press 1. For technical support, press 2. For billing, press 3. For information about our company, press 4. To repeat this message, press pound. That's a lot. It's a lot to give somebody. So even though it's like within that 20-second window, that's a lot to take in. It's a lot to listen to, especially as the first thing that you're hearing. It's not very engaging, and a lot of times what we hear from people is like rage, blackout, they just want to hang out. And it feels more like a barrier than it does an engagement. So something that we could try on this is, usually if we have DTMF, we have speech. It might not be natural language, it might be more directed dialogue where we have to come up with every single variance on it. So we might need to be very careful about the kinds of language that we're implying that people can use. And a lot of times that's why you go to this, so that people know exactly what to do in order to get on to the next step. But what we could do is, for example, that if you know the extension of the person you wish to reach, please enter it now. The main problem I have with that, well, two. One is most people, if they know the extension, they're going to put it in. They're not going to wait for this message to keep going. They're just going to dial that extension. So this is a direction that doesn't really need to be here. Please enter it now. That implies that you need to enter it in between enter it now and to speak with. If it doesn't happen in that moment, you've lost your window. Now you're panicking, you're trying to get your keypad up so that you can dial that extension and get it in before we hit to speak with. You don't want to create that kind of anxiety. So you could remove that line. You could also remove to speak with the operator, press 0 at any time. Everybody knows this. That's like the first thing anybody does on any call system is operator, operator, 0, 0, 0. We all know this, so you don't need to put that in there. And then you've listed out like the different options, how to get to them. Okay. To repeat this message, press pound. Now, this one is useful if you are going the DTMF route and only having key presses, but if we want to be more engaging and have that speech option, we can take this out and people will just ask for it. Because it's natural to say, huh, can you say that again? Can you repeat that? Especially if you phrase it in a way that's a little bit more natural, they'll respond naturally to you. So we could try something like this. Hi, let's put a greeting in there, it's the phone. Welcome to the ABC Company customer service line. I can get you to someone in sales, technical support, billing, or just give you some information about our company. We still have the exact same options that happened before, we're just getting to them much quicker. And then you can a lot of people will put a question like, how can I help you today? It's friendly, it opens it up, but I still have a problem with this one. And that problem is, how can I help you today? Especially at the beginning, This is a very broad question. Your user still doesn't really know what they can do in the system, and now you've just sort of swung the doors wide open by implying that you can help them with anything. Now it sounds like sales, technical support, billing, and information are some examples of some help you could provide, but they can also ask for like, I broke my knee, I want to talk to a doctor. Like, this is the customer service line, we don't have doctors. So the way to fix that is something like this: which one can I help you with? Now that narrows the scope and implies that those are the only options that I can help with, and you need to select one of those. You might still have some errors, but at least in this instance, you're going to have far fewer than if you have that, how can I help you? And you're going to have less people getting frustrated and just hanging up on you like you would with the first one. It's also important to think about sequential writing, especially when you are writing things like a cooking app or directions, driving directions. Our brains will try to put things in the order that they should be in. So something like turn on the coffee pot after going to the kitchen. Because voice is ethereal, we don't have any kind of screen or anything to grab onto. Oftentimes if you're telling somebody an action, they're gonna start doing it because they don't wanna like forget what's happening. So turn on the coffee pot. Okay, I'm gonna go turn on the coffee pot after going to the kitchen. Now I have to back up and wait, hang on. After, all right, so let me do some mental gymnastics and put after going to the kitchen, go to the kitchen first. Okay, then what was I supposed to do? I'm supposed to, right, turn on the coffee pot. It's a lot more work on your user than if you just say, go to the kitchen and turn on the coffee pot. So I can go to the kitchen and turn on the coffee pot. Great, I'm already in process of doing this. And just think about this if you're giving like driving directions. Turn right after you've turned left, like, whoa, hang on, now we're gonna like cause some car accidents. You really just wanna make sure that you're giving people the information in the order that they need it, so it's the easiest way for them to process it. Another thing that happens, and this is particularly useful when we're thinking about utterances and what we want to expect from people, is that we tend to mimic structure in a sentence in the same way that we mimic body language. So if we're talking to someone and somebody asks me, have you been to the zoo? Yes, I have. I take that have you from the first part of it, and I naturally want to put that in my statement back. But the key is this doesn't always happen. I could also say, not yet, or which zoo. So there are things that happen that we can use this structure to help guide what we're going to program into our accepted utterances, but you don't want to get caught up in only doing this. So let's practice. Here's where you can pull out your phones. This I think will be really helpful if we collect all of these on Twitter. So go ahead and use the hashtag WritingVUI, and I want you guys to come up with as many utterances as you can for have you ever tried pistachio chewing gum? I'll give you a minute. You can also write these on a piece of paper if you feel uncomfortable sharing them. Just come up with as many as you can. Okay, finish writing them up. All right, so there's a lot of ways that you can respond to this. This is a short list that I put together. And of course we've got the yes and yes I have, no I haven't. Something that people do when they're really comfortable is if they speak in a couple different languages, sometimes you might get that responding back to you. So like, yeah, claro. Or you might get things that are more slang oriented, like, yes, honey. You also get questions back. Is that an actual thing? I heard somebody over here say, why would I want to try pistachio chewing gum? All of these things are perfectly reasonable in the context of the conversation. So it's important to really, this is really the key to making a good conversation, is making people feel understood. And the way to make people feel understood is to think of all the ways that they could respond to something and make sure that your system is programmed to respond to them correctly. So this usually you come up with by sitting around and asking a bunch of people and thinking of all of them yourself, but then also prototyping, testing with people, and making sure that you are getting all different kinds of people to respond to you, so you're making this accessible to everybody. Which leads us into word choices. So what we have in the English language are a lot of words that sound like they mean the same thing. And so it can be very difficult to think about, like, well, what word should I pick for this? And I've actually gotten in some knockdown, drag-out fights over may versus might, which is silly, but also not, because you have to think about the weight that these words have and the implication that they have, so that when you're choosing them, it's really like for visual designers, when they are making choices on a font or on moving a pixel around, these are our pixels. We have to be really intentional with them. And something like may has a lot more shoulds involved in it. It sounds a little heavier. It sounds polite, but like maybe more weighted. And might sounds a little looser. Doesn't have that same gravitational pull to it that may does. Neither one of them is wrong, but you want to make sure that you're using in the right one in the right context. And this is where persona comes in, because you really want your persona to match the words that you're using and vice versa. If you have a persona who is a old male butler, and you ask it, do you like roller skating? Nah, brah, is probably gonna sound super weird coming out of its mouth. Not really is fine, but it doesn't really line up with that persona that you've created. I don't believe so, sir, really fits in a little bit more with that. So thinking about who is your character for this bot and how would they respond to it, because that will, again, keep that engagement going and make somebody feel like they're talking. We all sort of have this suspension of disbelief around bots and AI in general, is we know we're not talking to a human, but conversation is so human that we kind of just suspend that disbelief. And having the language grounded in a persona and connecting that together really helps us continue that suspension of disbelief and continue on in that conversation. And just to drive this point home, this is what it sounds like when you write something for a persona that everybody gets attached to and knows something about, and then you write something that's totally off base for them. Nope, never mind. All right. It's Alex Trebek saying, yes, queen. Real thing, real happen. Obviously does not sound great coming out of his mouth, because that's not what Alex Trebek represents to us. There it is. All right, so let's do it. Let's pretend that we have a weather bot. We've very cleverly named it Robot. So we have a user who's going to ask us, hi, Robot, what's the weather today? And I want you guys to write a response in our persona, which is Elmo. So I'll give you a minute, and I want you to write the bot response in Elmo's persona voice to what's the weather today. Go ahead. Okay, we'll wrap that one up. If you feel comfortable sharing it, I would love to see it, so please do tweet those out if you guys have a good one. Now let's try it again, but let's try it with a different persona to see how you might approach this differently. So let's do the exact same thing, except this time, use the persona of Eeyore. All right, go ahead. Okay. Again, please feel free to share these if you think you've got a good one. I would love, love, love to see it. I'm sure everybody else would too. All right. So one last thing about word choices is you really want to make sure that your conversational style matches to the goal of the product. So if you have a transactional product, something like you're going to order flowers and you're using a conversation for that, great. This is not a Faulkner novel. This is not the time for you to create your Faulkner novel, and do not wax on poetic about flowers. People are there to get something done. So you really need to keep things brief. You need to keep your words truncated and just make sure that you're helping them get through that process as easily as possible. However, if you have something more relational, if you are writing for like Deibel or a home bot, having something clipped and truncated like that is going to feel like the person who's obligated to talk to you and is trying to get out of there and is like checking their phone to see like, when is this up? So you do want to have more flowing conversation. You want to have a bit more of the chit chat and the small talk, because that's what the bot is there for. And mixing these is never great. So really think about like, what are you here to do so that you can match it for your user to know how to behave in that and also to have the most optimal experience. All right, let's talk about accessible cultural and social elements. This is actually my favorite thing to think about. First thing is manners. So whenever you're designing, you have to think about the culture that you're designing for, because everybody has a little bit different manners. Something like bargain, where you allow for interruptions. Interrupting is kind of rude. So we have to think about like, are we going to allow that? How are we going to respond to that? Maybe we're fine with it. Maybe those are the manners that we want to set up in our system. But you just need to be aware of it and set it up and be consistent throughout, because if you allow it in some places and then don't allow it in others, the user then starts to feel like, well, wait, you let me do this before. Now you're not letting me do it. Are you rude? Am I rude? There starts to become this like social battle embedded in the conversation, which obviously is not very engaging. You then get antagonistic, and it's not what you want. And the other thing to think about that's a big one that comes up is please and thank you. So if you do something and somebody says thank you, we all like to say like thank you back to the bot. I've seen this happen so many times. And I've also seen it happen where the bot doesn't accept that. So you say thank you, and then all of a sudden it goes, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Fine, I guess I won't be polite to you. And it just really erodes, again, that suspension of disbelief that we're having this conversation and that they're able to respond back to us. So you want to think about those things as you're going through. It's also important to think about other languages. So even if you're only designing in English, you're only designing for the US, think about who's going to be using this. I mean, we saw this a little bit in that pistachio chewing gum example of the yeah, claro. People might respond back in mixed languages. They might respond back in English, but accented English or broken English. Thinking about how they're going to talk to you and how you're talking to them. So it really helps to be clear and make sure that as much as you want to be personable and friendly, that the language that you're using makes sense to people who might not be native English speakers if that's part of your audience. So things like colloquialisms and idioms, things like slang, analogies, and metaphors. And by the way, this is not just related to people who don't speak English natively. This is also different age groups, different regions, different sub-communities. Everybody has a different way of communicating, so it's important that when you're using language, that you are willing to accept all of the language for all the communities that you're trying to reach, and also express that back to people. I will tell you one example of this that I've done, which is a mistake. I was designing an outbound health call for people in Ohio, and I thought, great, Midwestern, they're pretty friendly, I can do this. I'll do a little friendly thing of saying, let me take that off your plate. I'll take care of this for you. Except, what I didn't realize was that there was a very large refugee community in that area, and they had come from an Eastern African country that was dealing with famine. So food was a very valuable resource. So me having the bot say, let me take that off your plate, actually came off as a threat. Changed that right away. But you can see that like it's very easy, and it felt so friendly, and it felt like it fit that community, but you really have to do the research to make sure that you are reaching everybody that you are meant to be reaching. So let's do it. We've got our queen of folksyisms here for inspiration. I want you guys to write as many colloquialisms, idioms, metaphors, slang as you can. And again, that good old 1 minute. I'll give you 1 minute to do it. Write out as many as you can. All right, finish writing up those last ones. Okay, now take one of those and make it more clear. Make it so clear that there's no way that anyone can misinterpret what it is that you're saying. All right, ready? Go. All right, finish up. Okay, so something else that we want to think about is cultural references. So what kinds of cultural references are we making? This could be, what access do people have to this cultural reference? What socioeconomics are implied in this cultural reference? What is the cultural community that we're talking to with this? All of these things are embedded in cultural references. So when you throw something out like a movie or a song, you're putting it in a time frame, you're putting it in a certain group of people that would have access to that. That may not be a cultural touchstone for everyone in the group that you're trying to reach. And what happens is, I'll give you an example and then we'll talk about it. I was at a conference recently, and the keynote speaker was going along, everybody was engaged, they were in it, and all of a sudden he was trying to express some frustration. He was like, it's like when you forget to charge the Tesla and your wife gets really upset. That was about the reaction. Everybody was like, what? So obviously that was an example that most of the people in the audience, it's a luxury vehicle. They did not have that touch point to understand that. And we easily do this. I've done it before when I've been writing health stuff. So preventive health, a lot of times, we think about like, okay, well, we can't tell people, ride a bike or this because they might not know how to ride a bike. They might not have access to a bike. Well, we can tell them like, go for a walk. That's pretty innocuous. Everybody can go for a walk. Except not everybody really can go for a walk. They might not be in a safe area. They might be in an area where the weather does not allow for that. They might have other conditions that don't allow for that. So as soon as you give an example of something, what you're doing is you're making a group. So you're including people with that reference, but you're also excluding people. And you need to be aware of who you're including and who you're excluding, because part of that as soon as you exclude somebody from the conversation, they're out. They know this conversation's not for them and they're not going to continue to engage with it. And that's important to know, because if you want to be including them, then you need to make sure that that reference point is something that includes them too. Gender. I know we've all probably had this conversation or heard somebody had this conversation at some point of why are all the assistants female? I could be on a soapbox about that probably all day. But what I mostly want to bring up here for you guys is, as you are designing bots, I want you to think about, you don't have a face. You just have the voice. So why is your bot male or female? Think about that as you're making that decision, because it should be a very thoughtful decision. And what power dynamics, power structures are you propagating by making that choice? Is that something that you do want to continue out? You also want to think about, how does your system respond to pronouns? Again, with that inclusion-exclusion thing, how are you referring to others? How are you referring to your user? This gets very complicated quickly if you're thinking about they as singular versus they as plural, but it's important to have these thoughts and to have these discussions so that you're making these choices with these things in mind, and you're aware of who you're including and who you're excluding so that you can tailor that appropriately. Also, do you even need gender? You don't have the face. There are androgynous sounding voices. Just a thought. And all of these things lead up to humor. And humor is awesome. It really gives your bot a personality. It makes it feel, this is like one of the most engaging pieces that you can do. However, again, what kind of humor are you using? What are your touch points that you're using to create that humor? Does the language fit the persona? All of these things sort of fold into this and make it inclusive or exclusive. And, you know, dad jokes are pretty safe, but does everybody find them funny? I don't know. I do, but you just want to make sure that you're using humor carefully and thoughtfully so that you're not losing somebody on a throwaway joke that you didn't really need to have in the first place. So let's talk about sort of the medium of voice and how we can use it to its strengths. One of the things that we have in voice that is very difficult to do in a GUI is emphasis. So we can use voice to emphasize all kinds of things and direct somebody's attention to something the way that a director might use a camera to direct our attention. So the same sentence, would you like some food, would you like some food, can be said many different ways. In this case, would you like some food? Would you like some food? You can start to lead people where you need them to go or get specific answers from them. This helps with, like, when you're writing your utterances that you expect. This will help you with emphasis to guide them in the right place so that you can understand, like, okay, the way that somebody responds to, would you like some food? No, I wouldn't, but Susie would. Now we're talking about the subject there, so you can write utterances that are around that. Whereas, would you like some food? No, but I would like to see some shoes. Like, now we're talking about that, and we can think about all the things that fall into that category. There's also dynamics. This is so fun to play with, and this makes something very engaging when voice goes up and down, and like, it's in and out. So if you have a game, and you get to the end of it, and Jamal won, Jamal is the winner! That's so exciting, let's do it, let's celebrate, and it gets everybody together. Whereas if you have like a story app and you're telling the story and you want them to like really lean in and understand and be there with you, shh, did you hear that? That all of a sudden becomes much more engaging because you've been able to play with the dynamics and the volume and draw somebody in or become part of it with them, and the experience becomes fuller. We also have cadence and rhythm. This is very hard to do in writing because we just read through it and we're not hearing what it sounds like, whereas with voice, all we do is hear it. So 2 statements that basically say the same thing. You should get that checked out, or you may want to have someone take a look. Those are 2 different ways of saying essentially the same thing, but the first one is very efficient. It's very clipped. You hear all the enunciation that happens in that. You should get that checked out. It's very staccato. You may want to have someone take a look is a lot more flowing, and what it implies is a bit more softness, a bit more empathy, whereas the first one is more of like task-oriented. Neither one of them is wrong. It's just which situation would you use that in? You might tell them that, you know, for their plumbing, they should get that checked out. But for that weird mole on their skin, you may want to have someone take a look. Like, that's maybe a softer topic that you don't want to just throw somebody into. And overall, the most important thing to keep in mind is voice is a blind experience. We don't know what's coming. That's kind of why we get into it, is because it's really fun to just explore and learn new things. But for somebody who's trying to accomplish something, if you're doing that over voice, it's really important to give them some kind of progress bar the way that they would have on a screen so that they know where they are and they have grounding in that experience. So the way that we can do this in voice is things like, you're halfway there, just 2 more steps to go, bear with me 1 more minute. All those kinds of things give people grounding of like, okay, this is how long this is going to take me, this is where I'm going, and it allows them to continue on knowing that they're going to get this thing done. Not so great for relational things because, again, you don't want that friend who's like, 2 more minutes and let's wrap this up. Okay, that was a lot of information. So what do we do with it now? Got your handouts? If you don't have a handout, let me know and I will get one to you. But try using these when you're building your scripts. And go out and do it, because the more that you do these, even if you're just practicing building stuff for yourself, the more you're going to learn. Because you're going to start prototyping things, you're going to start reading these out to people, and you're going to realize, oh, wow, I missed something here. I didn't think about the way that somebody would want to respond to this, or I didn't think about that they would want to take this turn here, and I should accommodate that. And that's the best way to learn. You can also read a bunch of books. Some of these are VUI specific. Some of them are more on just straight up dialogue, like scripting and like playwriting. If you have any improv groups near you, I highly recommend going to an improv group and taking a class. You'll learn a lot about the way conversation works. We also have a Slack for VUI designers that you're welcome to join. And listen to podcasts, especially the ones that have conversation going on with them. It's a very easy way to do the stalking exercise without getting in trouble. And you can always reach out. I love to hear what people are up to, so please feel free to email me, tweet me, find me on Slack, and I would love to hear what you guys are up to. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody? Yes. So if you're creating a bot that doesn't have a gender, yes. What kind of considerations do you have when creating a voice? So there are TTS voices that can sound like gender neutral, and there's also, you can get voiceovers that don't necessarily fall into one or the other. But you want to think about like backstory and persona for this, right? Like if somebody asks a small talk question like, are you a boy or a girl? You want to have an answer to that. Somebody that does this really well is the Capital One Eno chatbot. Yeah. They're gender neutral, and so they've worked a lot around that kind of stuff. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep. Well, I would ask you, what are you building? Like, what are you trying to create? Is there a... Right. I don't think there's any reason why you would have to have a specific person for that. Like, there's not really... For most cases, I won't say all, because I'm sure as soon as I say that, I'll come up with one that's you shouldn't do that for. But for most cases, not having like a person in mind is fine, because you're just trying to, what you're looking for in a conversation typically is either you're trying to get something done quicker, or you're looking for empathy. You're looking for something human connection, which is why you would call somebody as opposed to like just looking online for instructions, or you would talk to the doctor as opposed to just like reading, oh, put a Band-Aid on your knee, that kind of thing. So you want that connection, and I don't think you have to have that from a human. And we also know going in, like, you should never be tricking somebody into thinking that it's a human. So people know going in that it's not, and it's perfectly fine for it to just be a robot and to respond to it in that way, because we don't really have, at least not yet, too many gendered robots. I mean, aside from like the strippers at that Vegas conference. It's weird. But there aren't, like, that hasn't really been gendered to the way that we've gendered humanity, so you can get away with a little bit more because it's AI. Other?
Do you have any worry that everybody expects a bot to always be able to tell jokes? Do you have always bots and joke tellers?
Not always. Health bots, for example, finance bots, nobody wants a joke from them. I've actually tried it. They don't want it. I think to a certain extent, yeah, like people want small talk because if they've had a pleasant experience, I will say this, they want small talk. They want to see like, oh cool, like what else can I do with this? So you should create something for that. Like I don't think that's a problem necessarily. It doesn't have to be jokes. It can just be like pleasant chit chat. It doesn't have to be like fully in depth. So I think it just really depends on what is the persona that you've created, what's the reason for your product in general, and then thinking about like, well, what makes sense here? Do we want to do some jokes, or should we just steer clear of that and have small talk? Anybody else? Yes. Yeah, there's, so Alexa actually has some emotional emphasis stuff that you can do. A voiceover, obviously, you could do that as well. And then I don't know of other TTSs, but I'm sure they probably exist or are coming out. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Uh-huh. So I've done it with voiceover is how I've used it to get that inflection and that cadence right. But I do know people that have used AWS to do it. Sweet. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a super good question. So for everybody who didn't hear that, she's talking about like dialogue gets very bland when you're trying to just be general, when you've got like a very big audience, like one of the main assistants. So how do you give it personality without excluding people? And I think part of that is what you accept. So if you can accept all the utterances and all their variances, that helps. That's like a big chunk of it. And then just thinking about like, okay, so if I do want to do a joke, and I know this is going to go out to somebody, like that's honestly, I think, why a lot of puns and dad jokes and like sort of silly things, like it can still show personality. It is on the safer side. If you want to go edgier, I think you can do it. I just think you need to be aware that like, okay, if somebody's going down this path, who is the person going down this path? How many people are going down this path, and what does that look like? Is everybody going down here? Is it just like a certain chunk of people going down here? And you can try to kind of tailor some of that so that you already know who's going in there, and the responses and the humor is geared towards those people. It's not always easy to do, I know. So I honestly don't have like a solid rule for that. My thought is just like I try it, and I try to do a lot of research ahead of time so that I get a sense for like how did people respond. One example I can tell you is I did, so I worked a lot in health tech, and I did an outbound call for smokers who had just been in the hospital for an entirely other reason, and the hospital had to reach out to them and be like, hey, you smoke, do you want to join this quit smoking class? Which, like, you know, every smoker loves to hear that quit smoking conversation, especially out of the blue from a robocall. So like, I knew going in that was going to be difficult, and so I did a bunch of research, and they were all very wry and sarcastic, so I thought, okay, maybe I can try some humor here. And I did, and it turned out they were like, no. Just because we want like a straightforward conversation doesn't mean that we actually want humor involved. So I think to your point about like, should humor be involved everywhere? Your users might not actually want it, even if they seem like they want it, even if they like are joking around a lot and they play with that. In the context of what you're doing, that might not actually be appropriate, so it might not even be needed, and you can just tailor the way you're speaking to them. In that case, I made it very like straightforward and like, I know, kind of like had the voice read a little more sarcastic and a little more like, I get it. And then behaviorally, I had it back off immediately if they were like, no, I want no part of this, so that it was respectful of it. I don't know. Yeah. If anybody comes up with a good answer to that, or a good example of that, I would be very interested to hear it. How do you make something that's general for everybody, not be bland, but still not be exclusive? All right, I don't want to make you guys late for lunch, so we're at the time. Go eat. Thank you, guys.